think of ancient Roman gladiators, we usually picture swords, shields, blood, and a roaring crowd. When we think of NFL, we picture helmets, pads, stadium lights, and athletes crashing into each other every Sunday. At first, these two worlds seem completely different. One belongs to ancient Rome, and the other belongs to modern America. But when we look closer, both reveal something important about society. People have always been fascinated by trained bodies, violence, discipline, and spectacle. For this project, I'm focusing on the athlete's body as public entertainment. More specifically, I'm comparing Roman gladiators with modern NFL players. The comparison is not perfect. Gladiators were often enslaved people, prisoners, or even men with low social status. NFL players, on the other hand, are free citizens who can become wealthy, famous, and admired. But both groups show how societies can turn bodily risk and pain into entertainment for a crowd. In ancient Rome, gladiators had a strange position in society. On one hand, they could become popular and admired by fans. On the other hand, they were legally and socially dishonored. Gladiators were considered infamous, meaning they were marked with shame and did not have the same respect or legal privileges as other Roman citizens. Gladiators were dishonored because their occupation involved submitting their bodies to the pleasure of others. That idea is important. The gladiator's body existed for the crowd. His strength, pain, courage, and even death became part of the show. This is where the NFL comparison becomes interesting. NFL players also submit their bodies to public entertainment. Their bodies are trained, watched, praised, criticized, and placed at risk in front of thousands of fans in stadiums and millions more watching on television. But unlike gladiators, NFL players are not legally dishonored. They are usually treated as celebrities. They can gain wealth, fame, sponsorship, and influence. So, the similarity is bodily sacrifice for entertainment. The difference is social status. Rome often turned fighters into dishonored performers, while modern America turns football players into heroes. The ancient text I'm using for this project comes from Epictetus' Discourses. In this passage, he describes the discipline required for someone who wants to compete athletically. He says that the athlete must follow rules, submit to a diet, train at fixed times, give up comfort, and give himself over to a trainer, almost like a patient gives himself to a doctor. He also describes the pain of competition. The athlete may be thrown down, dislocate an arm, twist an ankle, swallow dust, be beaten for negligence, and still lose. This sounds surprisingly similar to the way modern coaches talk about football. Athletes are told to sacrifice comfort, follow strict routines, endure pain, and keep going even when victory is not guaranteed. This quote shows that ancient athletics and combat training was not just about natural talent or strength. It required discipline, suffering, and control over the body. The same is true for NFL players. Football players do not simply show up on game day. They spend years lifting weights, practicing plays, following diets, recovering from injuries, and shaping their bodies for competition. Like gladiators and ancient athletes, they give much of their daily life to training. The artifact that I'm using is the Mons Gladys, which is known as the Sword of Tiberius. It is one of the most famous surviving examples of a Roman goddess. It was found near the Rhine River in Germany and is known for its iron blade and decorated bronze scabbard. The scabbard shows Roman power and military victory, including the general Tiberius presenting victory over Augustus. This artifact matters because the sword was more than just a weapon. In Roman culture, the sword represented violence, discipline, imperial power, and control over life and death. For a gladiator, a sword was the tool that made him entertaining, dangerous, and valuable to the crowd. His skill with the weapon could bring him fame, but it could also cost him his life. But there was another kind of sword that meant something very different. The wooden sword called the rudis. A metal sword could represent combat, blood, and death. A wooden sword could represent release. when a gladiator received a wooden sword, it symbolized honorable discharge from the arena. For some gladiators, especially enslaved fighters, this can mean freedom. This idea appears clearly in Martial's account of the fight between Priscus and Verus. In this combat, both gladiators fought so evenly and so bravely that the crowd repeatedly called for them to be released. But the emperor followed the rules and allowed the fight to continue until both the men finally yielded at the same time. Malthus writes that Caesar sent wooden swords and palms to both men. In other words, both fighters were rewarded, both were honored, and both won. That moment is powerful. It shows that the gladiator's body was controlled by others for entertainment, but victory could sometimes bring release. The same weapon shape that usually represented violence could be transformed into a symbol of freedom. This creates an interesting comparison with the NFL. Football players do not fight for legal freedom, and they're not enslaved gladiators, but they do fight for contracts, roster spots, championships, money, and respect. Their version of the wooden sword might be a Super Bowl ring, a Hall of Fame jacket, or retirement after a successful career. These symbols do not free them from slavery, but they do mark survival, achievement, and honor after years of bodily sacrifice. The NFL also shows how modern society struggles with the cost of spectacle. Football is exciting, partly because it's violent, fast, and physically dangerous. Fans admire big hits, toughness, and players who keep going through pain. But that entertainment comes at a cost. In recent years, concussions and long-term injuries have become major issues in football. The league now has medical evaluations, concussion protocols, and rule changes that meant to protect players. But even with modern medicine, helmets, and safety rules, the athlete's body is still at risk. This does not mean NFL players are the same as gladiators. Gladiators lived in a world where many fighters had little freedom, low legal status, and limited control over their lives. NFL players have contracts, unions, money, rights, and public admiration. But the comparison helps us see a larger pattern. Both Rome and modern America built entertainment cultures around controlled violence. Both turned athletes into symbols of courage, discipline, pain, and sacrifice, and both raise a difficult question. How much bodily risk are spectators willing to accept for entertainment? In the end, Roman gladiators and NFL players show that sport is never just sport. It is connected to class, money, freedom, fame, violence, and power. The Mons Gladius reminds us that the weapon in Rome was not only tools of battle, they were symbols of authority, danger, and victory. And the wooden sword reminds us that for a gladiator, the greatest victory was not always killing an opponent. Sometimes the greatest victory was walking away free. On the field or in the arena, the athlete's body becomes the center of public attention. The crowd cheers and the violence is controlled, and the spectacle continues.